When you're looking at how we view the world around us in the context, especially in this class, obviously from a Western university, you have to remember that one of the basic aspects, and this is actually a big area both in anthropology and geography, it's where we actually have some of our largest difficulty is in talking to, especially, you know, government officials, agencies, and such like that, is getting them to understand that their idea of data and reality is actually biased, and it's biased within the whole context of Western thought. This is especially true here because in Hawaii, we are both in the Pacific, so we're part of the Pacific world. We're also part of the rim that is very closely, by virtue of our culture and historical heritage, tied to Asia. And neither of those regions had anything to do with the Western intellectual tradition until recently. If you're from the mainland, like my Native American background, again, it wasn't until Columbus, quote, discovered the New World that the world of the Americas had any idea or any understanding of the Western intellectual tradition. And a lot of folks today still don't understand it. So it's important to realize that when you're looking at something like a university, like this class, like the idea of learning stuff, there are a set of biases that are inherent in that process. Now, you have to remember bias is a very technical term. Bias in engineering means that something's skewed, and that's probably the best way to think of it. A bias isn't necessarily bad. A bias just means to look at things from within a particular context or framework. And in the areas that I'm in, especially when we're looking at geography and things like cultural landscapes, you have to understand that folks are inherently biased. If you understand what those biases are, then you can address them and talk to those folks about them and maybe educate them. There's other ways of looking at the world, for example. If you just assume that that bias is the way things are supposed to be, then it gets very frustrating because you can't have those discussions. And to a certain extent, well, for example, if you look at the earlier stage of the whole Mauna Kea controversy, it involved the fact that there were two very distinctive biases. One bias was that a particular Hawaiian view of the relationship of a mountain was the only way things should be. And the other point of view was that a Western functional, sort of atmospheric thing was the only way that things should be. But of course, one of the problems was the University of Hawaii got itself right in the middle of it, which was pretty dumb. So they should know better. But nonetheless, those were both biases. Now, they're not wrong. Biases just mean that stuff comes from a particular framework. Where it becomes dangerous or frustrating, if you're in my areas, is that most folks, including most academics, don't really understand that the Western intellectual tradition, which is the stuff that you guys have gone through school, et cetera, is actually biased. It's got a set of sort of 3.5 basic premises that underlie almost all aspects of Western thought, and they're just sort of givens. It's not that they're wrong; they might actually be accurate, but they're not proven, and they're not some form of structural reality, like consuming oxygen, which is a structural reality. And they're all based in the Western Asian religious traditions. You have to remember, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all these religions sort of stacked on top of each other. The West Asian religions have always borrowed from each other. In fact, most of the Christianity is built on Judaism and Islam is built on Christianity. So they're very complex relations, but they're all based on a set of very, very similar premises. But those premises are unique to that set of religions. They're not found in other religions like Zoroastrianism. They're not found in Buddhism. They're not found in Shinto or religions like that. And yet they are the basis of Western thought. So the first of these is the idea of psychic unity. And this underlies a huge part of the behavioral sciences because, among other things, without psychic unity, the discipline of psychology becomes really problematic. This is based on the idea of creation. God creates the world. God creates everything in the world or the universe. And they're all made to a particular specification. Now, in the West Asian tradition, you have the idea that God creates people. And God creates a small group of people, and those people intermarry, interbreed, and from that becomes the modern human population. Now, because they were made by a divine entity, all those things are basically built the same. So they're like my Samsung phone or an iPhone 14 or something like that. They're all to the basic same specs. So psychic unity is the idea that since our brains and since we were all created at one point in time and we're all the descendants of that point of creation, that basically ourselves as entities and also the way that we think and the way our brains operate are the same. That's why it's called psychic unity, in the sense that that we all experience the world the same way, we all see the world the same way, our brains all function the same way, and there's, to a certain extent, the emotions, perception, everything are the same. This is unique to the West Asian traditions. I can't emphasize that enough. Other places, most of the groups in the world do not have that. I grew up in a system where you do not have the concept of psychic unity. This radically changes the way you view things. Among other things, you can't go and diss on people because they're acting differently if you don't have psychic unity. If you assume psychic unity, then you can, as people love to on TikTok and Instagram, you can critique people for their behavior because you know what those behaviors should be. And since everyone's built the same way, you can score those people in terms of whether they're being good or bad or doing appropriate behavior because everyone lives in the same psychic, intellectual, mental world. So people have a choice based on that background. This becomes the basis of psychology. If you go into the offices, this is the DSM testing where you decide if someone's got mental issues based on how far off the norm for behavior they are. This assumes that you've got psychic unity. If you don't assume that, if you don't assume that people perceive the same world, if you don't assume that people's brains work the same way, you're not saying they don't, you just can't assume they do, then all of a sudden you can't have a DSM test. You can't diss on people if they're acting differently because you don't know if they live in the same world that you do. You don't know if they see the same things that you do. You know, if they taste and hear the same things you do. You can hope that they do, but you can't make the knee-jerk assumption that they do. So psychic unity is absolutely critical to Western thought. And you have to remember, if you go to Asia, if you're in the Pacific, if you're even in Native American populations in the New World, this is not part of the world that anyone grew up in. I don't assume that anyone else lives in the same or perceives the same world I do. I didn't grow up with that. I've learned it. I obviously can teach it, but I don't believe it. And what it means is everyone's unique and everyone's different. Now, you see this classically here in Hawaii with the concept of clan. If a group of people are descended from a common ancestor, which is the anthropological definition of a clan, then by definition, they are going to have psychic unity. But it stops at that group. And this is why in the Pacific and many other parts of the world, if you're not part of that particular family or group, then people will treat you differently, in large part just because they do not know what makes you different. Hang on a second. Sorry. What it means, if you're outside of that group, then basically you're never going to have the same level of trust or acceptance because they do not see you as being them. In a formal way, this is how Japanese operate. This is why if you're a foreigner, you can't become a Japanese citizen. This is why if you're Japanese, you leave Japan for too long, you're not considered truly Japanese because they don't see that you have the same psychic functions. You might, but they can't assume that you do. And so therefore they don't feel that they can judge you or make assumptions of how you're supposed to behave because they don't know if that's the way you work. Psychic unity is absolutely critical to who you perceive as being like you. The 10 Commandments, for example, as a mode of behavior, are very hard to apply in a non-psychic unity world, which is one reason why religions like Buddhism really don't have the same set of sort of moral social codes that you can hold people up to all the time. So psychic unity is a very peculiar part of Western thought. It underlies everything from the grades that you get in class to the way you're expected to behave to disciplines that you study. And for example, those either in things like design, it would assume that, for example, people's relationship with color, and they even see the same colors, that they operate and have emotional relationships in the same way to particular colors, would be very problematic, which I would argue is totally the case. So things like symbolism, for example, then become very complicated if you can't assume psychic unity. So psychic unity is one of the key ones. It's not that it's not accurate. It's just that the minute you make the assumption that is in play, you're really putting yourself out there because you're making a set of assumptions you really can't prove. And there's, at least in anthropology specifically, there's a huge amount of evidence that psychic unity is not accurate. The second of these is what we call unilinear evolution. Again, this comes out of the West Asian religious traditions. Is God created everything in a particular point in time, 7 days, I think. And so everything was bam. The world was formed, the universe was formed. And so the world was formed, which means, all the rivers, everything else were formed. And so what this also means is then that all this stuff should basically be the same. Since everything evolved out of a particular point in time, it all has commonality. What this also means that is if you're looking at the human species, is since we all come out of the Garden of Eden at a particular point in time, and we're all descendants of the folks in the Garden of Eden, that we all share a common heritage. Again, think of psychic unity. It also means that as groups go and change the world around them, there's this idea that you should improve yourself. Again, this is very much out of the West Asian religious traditions, the idea of improvement, that you're supposed to strive to be worthy of the divine. You're supposed to strive to be worthy of going to paradise or to heaven or whatever. And this is a constant, theme in the West Asian religions, this idea of improvement. Now, it's not unique. Most religions have some idea of improvement, but the idea that all this improvement can basically be compared to everyone else's in terms of who's most improved. In other words, think of it's like a race. It's running a marathon. Everyone's starts at the same point. They're all running the marathon together. So you can basically say who's most improved and who's least improved. You can compare them because you're assuming commonality. A unilinear evolution is a huge part of Western thought. If you're talking about history, if you're talking about any of the Western intellectual traditions you're exposed to it at high school or university, that's almost invariably at some point tied to this idea of unilinear evolution. It's also then used very much when you're stereotyping groups, especially groups that aren't part of this, because then you can say, well, this group is really primitive, or this group has just not really got it together because they're too lazy, or they're too this, or they're too that. And basically you then use this evolution to basically segregate or stereotype a particular group, or positively stereotype your own group as being the most improved, the most successful, the most this, the most that. Huge part of ethnocentrism based on unilinear evolution, especially in the Western tradition, Europe and the United States. Third is homeostasis. Homeostasis is the idea that homeostasis, of course, is a technical term used in the sciences, and it means steady state. In our terms, it almost means more static, but steady state is probably the easiest one. So homeostasis is norm. And again, when you think about it, you've got a tradition where the divine made the world, made the universe, then they made it to a situation, and when you're at the positive normative pattern, that's what you're striving for. It's not by accident. The Western tradition, there's very strong, sort of definitions of what paradise or heaven is. And paradise or heaven are basically homeostasis, that you've got these perfect worlds where nothing needs to be changed and nothing goes wrong and that's the idea of homeostasis. Now, in the world that we live in, the idea of homeostasis is that things should remain the same unless you change them. And if you change them, going back to evolution, it should be to improve them. So that if you don't improve things, same things should remain the same. This week should be like last week, should be like next week. That would be homeostasis. The idea that that's the norm, that unless people actively change the world around them, the world will remain the same, is a huge part of Western thought. And you can see this probably most classically right now with this whole discussion of climate change, both pointing the finger at the fact that change is occurring and also the shock that to a certain extent climate change is now the norm. That really bugs people because they assume that the world should be the same this year as it was 5 years ago, and therefore if it's changing, that's not a good thing. So homeostasis is the positive norm, as again the other one of these sort of Western thought traditions. And this one's important because it underlies a lot of the ideas of that you can measure sort of a foundational norm and then you measure variations off of that, especially say in behavior or attitudes. The last of these is sort of like the 0.5 version. And this is the relationship with the world around us. The Western intellectual tradition is very much grounded in the idea of West Asian religions, which again is the divine made everything. In this context, the one thing that the three religions have in common is these West Asian religions all have it very clearly defined that the divine, i.e. God, put people in a peculiar situation vis-a-vis the rest of the world. People are put in basically stewardship of the world. So people aren't part of nature. People are sort of like the manager. They're in charge of nature. They're the zookeeper. And this is a very peculiar thing that's not found in other societies and other religious, social, conceptual traditions. So it's a very peculiar part. And of course, it underlies a huge part of Western thought, everything from the way that we modify a landscape to the humane society to all this type of stuff is based on this idea that man is in contrast to nature, that we're not part of nature. Almost all other groups have a very strong sense that man is actually within nature, that people are just part of the natural system. And this radically changes everything you have. If you go to someplace like Hong Kong, this is why you don't find a humane society. Humane society or prevention of cruelty to animals is based on the idea that men are in a superior position. Therefore, one of their obligations is to take care of the rest of the world. If in the Asian tradition you have people as part of nature, then why would you have a humane society? Why is it people's obligations to take care of dogs and cats? They're no more or less part of nature than people are. So you don't find those types of relationships. Let's take a quick look at two images to sort of amplify this. Okay, here in the American Southwest, this is one of the cliff dwellings. Oftentimes these folks are called Anasazi, which isn't quite right, but we'll stay with that. This is a clan compound. This is a group of people, almost all of them were related. Some of these are storage areas, these big pits. Others are actually ritual spots. The Anasazi lived in a world where they were part of nature. They lived in a world which, by our standards, Euro-American standards, was pretty grim. People were actually things that were predated upon. So one of the versions of this would be sort of people were sort of seen as like rabbits. You could hunt them and eat them. So people weren't in a position of dominance. People were very not top of the feeding chain. And so part of this is you see this with this kiva here, for example, which is a ritual pit that you go into to interact with your ancestors and other spirits that will protect you. The fact that you build your buildings in areas of protection, they're integrated in the world around you because you are part of that world. You're not on top of that world. This isn't like Tucson or Phoenix, Arizona, or Scottsdale, God no. But it's the same area, but it's a different relationship with the physical world. It's a different relationship with the conceptual and cultural world. So this is a different built environment that reflects a different set of sort of philosophies and attitudes and understanding than what you see in the Western man in contrast or domination of nature. This is note you're going to be seeing a lot of Asian images in this class simply because, one, that's my area of specialty. And secondly, unlike, my other area of specialty, which is Hawaii, is that a lot of the stuff is visually very easy to access. So it's easy for someone who's not part of the group to see it. Understand it's a whole different thing. So this goes back to when we were talking about symbolism before, built environment. This is a built structure. This is a, quote, lantern, unquote. Everything here is constructed. The cherry trees and the evergreens are put in here. We're put in here. This is Nanzenji, which is one of the big, very powerful shrines in Kyoto, in Japan, that was put up about 800 years ago. So all this is actually quite old. It's not what it used to be. Prior to that, it was probably rice fields. So it was turned into, it was converted. So all this is human constructed. This is a cultural landscape. It's a built environment. Having said that, it doesn't have necessarily the idea of improvements and stuff, and it certainly doesn't have the idea of dominance that you get in the Western world. In the Asian context, what you find is people are seen as very clever animals. We are part of the animal kingdom. We're part of the world around us, but we're just more clever than a lot of other animals. What you also find in the Asian tradition, I think it's really hard for Americans to sort of grasp, is it's a world that's full of things. These things can take all sorts of various forms. They exist in a world that's not corporeal, so they're not actually part of the visible world that we're in. So this is an example of that. This particular structure here, this lantern, isn't intended to be a lit lantern. I suppose you could put a candle in it, but if you look at it, you're not going to get much light out of it because there's almost no, it's almost solid stone. This is intended to be sort of like a temporary repository or a place where a kami or spirit would reside. In the Japanese sort of relationship with the world around them, kami or spirits are based to particular places, either a particular tree, a particular body of water, a fountain or spring, or just a particular rock. But they can also move around fairly short distances. So what you had was there were a kami here in this area. And so this particular structure, this particular thing was put up as a place for kami to reside. And the reason that you do that is kami are more powerful than people. And so if you give them a place to stay, they're going to be happy and they won't be pissed off. They won't give you a hard time or cause trouble. So you're both showing them respect and also honoring them and also giving them a comfortable place to hang out. So on one hand, in a Western context, this would be a, quote, Japanese stone lantern, unquote. In a Japanese context, this is reflecting a set of relationships that people have with the world around them. People are clever. People can build a lantern. People can plant the cherries, but the cherry trees grow without people. The evergreens grow without people, just not here. And the lantern wouldn't exist, but the kami would be around. And so you can't tell kami what to do, but kami can tell you what to do. So because you're clever, you build things that PR them so that they will then be positively, swayed towards what you want, or just maybe not give you any trouble. So this is a really good example of what happens when you don't have this idea of man and dominance of nature, especially in sort of competition with. You see this a lot with, Western, especially American context of when flooding occurs. It's like, oh no, how could it flood? You've got to change the way the streams work or how you have drainage so that you can make that not happen again. In most societies in the world, flooding is just part of the world, and you just live with it. You might not be happy with it. You might try to sort of modify how you impact or you're impacted by it, but it's just going to happen. And you can see this classically here if you look at this whole discussion of what to do with the Ala-Wai watershed and what happens if Waikiki floods. Well, in a Hawaiian context, yeah, it would flood. You've messed up the landscape. You've messed up the relationships of things in the world around them. So yeah, there's going to be consequences. But in the Western context, you can concrete, modify, and make sure that basically that flood won't happen. You can shape and modify and control and dominate nature to the extent that you can basically define the world around you. Something that most people on the planet are very uncomfortable with and don't really understand and don't really buy the argument.